Is that I was communicating with a former PhD advisee of mine who now teaches in the UK, and he quipped when he heard that I was coming to do this. He said he imagined that I would be focusing more on the barbarism side of things, and indeed, I think I might. And so great might my inclination be to avoid the civilized that I should confess that until this invitation, I had never seen Kenneth Clark's famous series, although the Berger response has become somewhat familiar to me in my own art historical training. So I may have perhaps understood slightly differently the stakes of our conversation today. And Fred asked that I address the art historical moment in France in the 50s through the 70s, focusing on the way points of critique developed in relationship to what he discreetly puts as the political and, in parentheses, post-colonial situation. A post-colonial situation I don't think that France quite achieved in the 50s and through the 70s, and perhaps probably not yet today. Though we could say perhaps it's perpetuated in this ongoing postness. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how best to respond to this challenge, given that most of my own investment in this period of time and this project has been retrospective, which is to say I've taken the form, I've worked to grapple with the discursive traditions that have developed since in the present moment in the art history that I was taught, which is very different from that art history. But I have tried to understand how our work then has codified the histories that were generated during that time, perhaps more than the art histories. I've been less interested in art historical models of that moment, in large part because of my own bias and areas of concern, which is to say contemporary art production. And at that moment, the contemporary art was not yet or was just coming to be theorized, but never as a historical problem, which I might say is part of the problem. So I wrote a book, which still feels very new to me, but it's been out for a little while. It's called From a Nation Torn. And in the book, I argue that the retrospective art historical positioning of the 50s and 1960s as one that is post-war diminishes the significance, both historically, experientially, and for our purposes aesthetically, of what were actually a series of wars, most of which were fought under the mantle of continuing or dismantling the colonial occupation in, again, just France's case, large parts of North Africa and West Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. So this periodization also includes the important ways in which the aesthetic models developed in France during this time that circulated in some ways as if their own empire, as well as the artistic and spatial practices of the moment were formulated very specifically in relationship to these wars of decolonization and perhaps a very different set of thems that they sort of signified. When Adrian suggested he was going to be referring to a plural pronoun today, I thought perhaps it was them, but imagined a very different nominal subject of that term. So I suggest, again, to continue that these efforts to keep the wars invisible, or at least out of something that I want to think of as public view, was a primary, if unstated, ambition of institutionalized aesthetics during the moment of national reconstruction and recovery that followed the Nazi occupation during World War II, and also coincided with the gradual Europeanization of markets. Our own art historical discourse, I argue, therefore reduplicates the efforts made at that time, which is to say in the 1940s through the 1960s, to obscure, in fact, that historical present as something that was both historical and present, and also to say visible and experienceable. In this instance, then, I might say, though I think perhaps without wanting to include mention or different enunciative possibilities, that I am also suspicious of the love of art, though I think suspicion does not mean to say I would want to dismiss or forego it or those who might love it, but I would want to be thoughtful about what some of that might code or what it might have coded, and how various different ways of loving art might have had their own enunciative effect. But because I'm not, in fact, a total barbarian, I will not try to overstate a case, which is to say that and simplify that there was all good or all bad at this time. And there were exceptions, of course, to erase, exceptions to this effort that I want to argue that was happening through aesthetic models to erase and make invisible. And there are a number of important figures that we could think of in terms of an aesthetic history that's developing. At the moment, Sartre, for instance, had been very much invested in the project of shedding light or making visible the kinds of torture, for example, that was being employed in the war to keep Algeria part of France on one side and the war to make Algeria its own sovereign nation on the other. Indeed, there are a number of famous humanists who signed the declaration of the 161, and they opposed this war and attempted to make it visible in some ways, although that was not really the stated purpose of that then censored and now much celebrated petition. But such efforts, I argue, in thinking about history, had a lot more to do with the defense of a kind of French republicanism and a denunciation of the fascism that had characterized the occupation of France and Vichy, and condemning the war, the tactics used to fight it, or the colonization that had produced it was, in other words, still to defend France in a kind of individualist expression. And so that's why I'm starting to show you, as I begin to move towards artworks, I wanted to show you two pieces of work that have now been taken up in art historical discourse of the present as demonstrating often a critique of colonial violence and demonstrating perhaps a political engagement with this moment that we might think of as a stronger indication that there was a voice of refusal. There are two, two different works by Jean-Jacques Lebel. One is called The Anti-Process, and the other is called La Justice. Sorry, I'm not showing you that one. This is called Manifeste Algérien, and they refer rather quite explicitly and nominally to political events, things that were happening at the time. But as you start to get a sense from, this is the widow of a woman, a reporter who was tortured in Algeria. This is about trials that were being prosecuted against various resistors in France, but yet we see their manifestation in these kinds of orgiastic happenings, where the idea of an anti-trial or resistance to a state model ends up being about the expression of an individual liberty, which, not to reduce to a good or a bad, ends up including, again, a certain voice of a them, for example. So in thinking about how to encapsulate some of this earlier research and expand upon it in the context of today's discussion, I thought I might, in fact, start with this, which is the work of art by actually a contemporary American artist. And I thought this might be a good way to introduce the various strands of activity and thought that dominated French visual theory in the 50s and 60s, and might indicate the ways in which they were codified in institutional models that in and of themselves strive to formulate new publics, new communities that were codified, publics that at this point still excluded, again, a number of these enunciative voices, in particular those who we might describe as subaltern, who had remained subject to being represented rather than being ascribed the power of representing or enunciating. So thinking about institutions and publics will bring me to focus on two figures, very briefly, who are exemplary in this demonstration. One of them is André Malraux, and the other is a man named Pierre Gaudi. So the work that I'm showing here is, it's called the Algerian Annex, and it was made in 1989 for an exhibition called Images Critiques that was curated by Béatrice Perron at the Museum of the Modern Art of the City of Paris, one of the institutions that I touch on later in thinking about Pierre Gaudibert's work. It's a site-specific work that deliberately and systematically addresses the mechanisms by which the confluence of culture and nation were conditioned by the institutional frameworks of the time, and how those were promoted as ideologically neutral vessels of aesthetic value, such as was this site, the Young Museum of Modern Art. The work proffers a useful and legible critique of colonial dynamics and their expression in both the representational practices and the public spaces that were newly built at the time or newly redesignated to frame them. And here, the discourse, on the one hand, of a kind of national art school, or its contrast with the image of public space. In combining, interrogating different orders of representation as they issued from different cultural practices, here art and assembly, the work also provides its own analysis of the civilization thesis that has organized our gathering today, even if in reverse. So the work occupied an enclosed glass room. There was something of a cross between an architectural pavilion and expanded vitrine that was located in the space between the entrance and exit stairs of the museum. I'm just showing you here the museum, the triumphant form of which was realized for the 1930 Exposition International and concentrated as a museum of art in 1947. Opposite a glass wall, this glass wall, the artist created a second hung wall that he positioned 32 inches off the ground. And on it, he hung 4 abstract paintings that he had selected and so re-curated from the museum's permanent collection. They were made by prominent painters such as Hans Hartung, Simon Antaille, Jean Degotex, and Pierre Soulages in the period between the end of World War II and the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence. These 4 works were considered emblematic of the, quote, lyrical or, quote, gestural abstraction that marked the work of the then celebrated cultural achievements of the so-called Nouvelle École de Paris, work that had been championed in an art critical context since 1952 by critics including Charles Estienne, Michel Ragon, and for a time Pierre Restany, who, for those of you who know French art in this period of time, you might recognize as leading figures of 1960s art criticism. Although it was initiated as a style, or as a series of styles, one might say, lyrical abstraction, for example, in 1941, the so-called school was only appropriated on a large scale or come to be celebrated in the 1950s, and perhaps at that moment because it might have marked a continuity with French practices of an earlier École de Paris from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So behind this installation and towards a third wall that he'd created to foreshorten the space, Adams positioned 4 projectors. These were made to present a redoubled archival photograph, and you'll see in his sort of maquette for what the work would look like. Well, you can't see, it's too small, but originally, he'd chosen to flank this installation on the stairs leading up to the museum with images that he took from a famous film by Pontecorvo called The Battle of Algiers. The photograph he ends up choosing, which we see here, it shows a crowd of Algerian women and children taken at what would seem to be either an early demonstration for Algerian independence in Algiers or a celebration of the same in 1962. So issuing in a manner of speaking from the backsides of the paintings, the image became visible from the front of the installation through the mirage-like reflection it generated off a grid of mirrored tiles that Adams had installed on the floor between the 2 walls. In this way, the panorama of protesting women shone forth like a ghostly apparition in the gap beneath the 4 suspended paintings, shifting focus and moving in relation to the viewer's position outside the locked doors. So this viewer was literally shut out and forced to remain outside the space, looking inward as she tried to pin down the hazy image of this history with her gaze. By juxtaposing these women and children in the midst of claiming their rights to sovereignty with the revered abstraction of 4 male modernists, Adams' works asks what sort of vision the institutional space foments, and in particular, how it did so in the very space of this museum that had been nationalized again as a museum of modern art in 1947, and then conjoined with the city-sponsored institution of modern art that we now know this building to host since 1977, when the national end of the collection was transferred to the Pompidou Center. So insofar as the orders of colonialism and decolonization range in variance with those of art and popular representations, Adams' work would seem to suggest that, at least in the context of history cultivated at the moment by this museum, the Museum of Modern Art of the City of Paris, the relationship between culture and context was and remains a distinctly negative one. By juxtaposing the sealed, hermetic space of the reflective, floored, glass-enclosed museum with that of the distorted and chaotic cityscape pictured and here multiplied in the photographic image of the Algerian women, Adams's installation alludes to the institution's usual exemption of external urban spaces, especially those of public protest, even as its architecture depends on and has traditionally participated in the formation of those very same spaces. This is something that we see as more reversed today, and some of the practices I won't get to talk about a lot in the 1960s and 70s tried to reverse, and we might say that they in fact ended up having the same kinds of exclusionary consequences in some ways. Well, I'll leave that. So the work also forcibly reminds us of the exemption of the many invisible subjects from the repertoire of representations within the museum and the histories it constructs of what and who constitutes culture, and then by extension here today, civilization. So these are precisely the conditions of the standardized art historical discourse that emerges from France at the time and develops to this day in constructions of national lineage, to the point that we can even be talking about specifically French or British or German models of art historical discourse or even art making. An exclusion, develops in the construction of national lineage at the exclusion of all other kinds of ways that one might theorize not only the high art objects that the discourse of both Clark and Berger have revered, but also the other efforts to theorize visual, spatial, and public components that in their aggregate make what we call art. So in reminding us of the absent historical content of the high modernist abstraction that dominates the paintings he reframes and their rather short-lived reception as representative of a specifically French mode of production, Adams's work introduces an art historical lesson by stressing the context in which these works were made and celebrated. Here, context, and indeed content, or lack thereof, are not wielded as interpretive tools, but as ones that aim to undo the logic upon which such context and content were generated and by which they became historical. So it's to this historical turn that I now turn with a few words about André Malraux and Pierre Gaudi, who from different political ends of the spectrum were engaged in this process. There are, of course, a number of other figures that we could consider, but I've chosen these two because the one, André Malraux, was responsible for or made to be at least the nominal representation of the codification and consolidation of culture as a professional and national problem at the start of the Fifth Republic in 1958, a republic tasked with resolving a problem of decolonization. So nominally, we should also note that a national cultural project was already different or diverged from the civilizing missions, quote unquote, that had been used to justify the colonial period and the occupation of foreign lands, broadly speaking. So Malraux, named France's first minister in charge of culture in 1959, engaged on a wide sweep of cultural projects such as the distributed network of small museums and houses of culture that he established throughout the 1960s around France. And these, Christian Ross and a number of other critics and theorists have described as quote unquote colonizing the provinces with a sea of administrators and bureaucrats who were in need of work fresh from their return at their colonial posts. It was, as she and many others have described, a kind of civilizing mission redoubled, one that tried to bring the objects of high culture or an exclusively cultural form of civilization to masses at large throughout the country. Funds for this project had been diverted from education ministries and various ministries of public information that had been collapsed into the single dossier of culture under Malraux's position. So I agree with these assessments, and their histories are great, and I refer you to read them. But I'm more interested in the effects of this culture that were propagated in these centers and the formulation specifically of the visual, upon which at least that aspect of their programming depended. And so in this, I want to think about Melrose Aesthetics and what the model of not quite an art history, but a way of thinking about image and its relationship to history that comes from his writings, his pre-governmental ministerial projects, and then get imposed, I would say, or endeavored to be imposed on spaces, both urban and museal. So, and so this is a huge task that I can't rehearse entirely right now, but I want to give you some demonstration of it. I want to think about these aesthetics as they were articulated in a book that he wrote called Les Voix de Silence, translated The Voices of Silence. And it's often considered as an exemplum of a sort of French modernist image theorizing in its teleological defense of abstraction, specifically French abstraction, and decontextualization. This has, I think, much more to do with the history of art, much less to do with the history of art, than the history of the image or the picture that render the art objects amassed into an imaginary collection that Malraux fetishizes as something like belonging to a social unconscious. The pictures and the images that render these works representations and yet also new realities. And here I'll go to these. But first I'll just say a little bit, these images are probably at least the one to your left in the upper hand is very well known. This is a picture of the new minister in his office sorting through the plates of actually a slightly later version of this book. But I like the two other images there. They show just how posed and staged this project was. And here he is in his home, at home in these images loving art. And here promoting some image of himself. It also occurred to me that when Adrian was talking, there is something about this project. It's being, in some ways, recuperated right now or returned to by a number of people, and it's not significantly unlike, to a certain degree, the historical model that is articulated in the Bazin text, and does espouse a kind of timelessness that has to do with producing a love of art or an essential quality of art. And I think that's something that is not without its political motivations at the time or its ideological undercurrents, and certainly is perhaps also not as well as what it is that time has come to mean in the world continues to change. So in this treatise on the Imaginary Museum, first drafted in 1947, revised several times, along with other various treatises, and then codified in the Voices of Silence from 1951. The vast repository of images that he collects, many of which, of course, documented works that had been taken from various moments of imperial relation to foreign lands, are described by Malraux in a language that a Byzantinist and curator at the Louvre, his name is Georges Dutuit, he's also a very close friend of Samuel Beckett. He noted in a 1951 response to this book that it was replete with a language of not, in fact, love for these images. Well, there's that too, but a rhetoric of violence. Just as these images were often violently rendered from their context. And by that, I mean not only the objects they're documenting, but the particular use of the fragment to represent larger works. In the book, Malraux describes images as tearing, as conquering, as transforming, as making and demanding submission, often the submission of the viewer. So in his assessment of what an imaginary museum made of such images, photographic images, would do, Malraux describes it as producing, in fact, a historical knowledge, or producing, rather, the necessary conclusion that historical knowledge, at least insofar as it concerns images, is superficial, quote, superficial, and unnecessary in the appreciation of a stream of style and aesthetic assimilation. He writes, quote, Count Duke Olivares has become pure Velasquez, and what do we care if the man with a helmet or a man with a glove, who that man may have been in real life? For us, their names are Rembrandt and Titian, a sort of reiteration of it doesn't matter what is being depicted, it matters who made it. Similarly, the fragment of an African figurine becomes demonstrative of the cropped and edited stylistic embellishment of an abstract flourish, and so too does a detail of a medieval chapel become representative abstraction through a similitude that is cultivated by their reproduction as photographic fragments. In this, the whole argument and the model of vision that Malraux would come to impose as Minister of Culture, here I'm just going to nod to one of his impositions, which is the restoration programs for the city of Paris. That aesthetic vision depends on a model of photography, a medium that he strips in this long treatise of its capacity to document even the art images that it is collecting, to one that in that documentation actually creates. It imposes changes in texture, color, etc. And he uses that model to talk about photography, which had been conceived of at the time or was being theorized as having the capacity to represent, in particular, to represent voices of those, voices and bodies of those who might not otherwise have been seen. Malraux renders photography a medium that is capable of fiction. Is not capable of fiction, which he describes as having a narrative function, but instead it is fictitious, it is constructed, and it tells us essentially the equivalent of lies. So in this, his project reduces the claims that art has on life, as well as the claims that documentary fact has on history. And it might be overstated to suggest that his aesthetic ruminations naturalize the historical occlusions that I have suggested organized, largely in this book, organized French aesthetic and institutional culture in the period. But it is worth noting that they were ideas and ways of thinking that coincided entirely, again to be schematic, with two great moments of social historical revisionism in France, two moments of historical and juridical forgetting when so-called amnesia laws were put into place. Other ways of making historical knowledge superficial or not important. The first of these was in the late 40s and 50s, when the crimes of collaboration and also of apparation, the sort of turning against those who had collaborated, were forgiven with the effect of universalizing and mythologizing the resistance and obscuring its negative counter. And the second cycle begins in the late 1960s and continues, in fact, till 2005, at least juridically, and socially, we might say it continues to this day, when the colonial abuses in Algeria, as well as the right-wing extremism of certain French generals who launched their fight against Algerian sovereignty by, in fact, attacking the French, all of those crimes were also forgiven. So it's at that second moment that Malraux took what I have argued is this way of understanding aesthetics as based on a kind of fragmented transformation of a document of the real, and imposes them to a certain degree on his redevelopment of the city of Paris. And I apologize, this is not going to be an argument so much as just a claim. These plans were enabled by a law, in fact, plans to preserve but essentially restore and return to a facade of its original appearance, something like an empty photographic signifier, or photographic signifier as he has reconstructed it to work. The plans were enabled by a law that he put to the legislature where it was passed in the 1960s as bearing his name, that was aimed at and mostly did restore the urban form of the Malraux to the image that it had assumed on the map before the late 18th century, before, that is to say, the colonial period, and what had been revealed by the 1960s as the outcomes of that period. So at the same time, the plan displaced and so removed from view living evidence, to say the bodies of the history that had lived, that continued to exist as sort of signs of this history in certain parts of the city, this in particular. So in Melrose Aesthetics, we see the transition from the page to the museum and the art fair. I skipped this, but also organized the 1959 Biennial of Paris, rather, as a way of promoting, again, this site of culture and civilization, perpetuating in France at least as a place that could receive international culture. So we see this transition from the page to the museum and the art fair to the city, where it took its most extreme realization as a grounds on which a certain kind of amnesia might be nationalized, an aesthetics of an erasure and dehistoricization made natural. And there's a lot more that we could say about a kind of architecture or urbanism of erasure and what it means to make invisible not only historical fact, but the contest over what those historical facts have been. But for now, I'll just say that Malraux's treatment of the city prepared it in some ways, or coincided, to be a little bit less schematic about it, coincided with a kind of historical amnesia or a kind of willful unseeing of the moment that is perpetuated and thought of in a long history, and I won't detail it too much, of remembering only that which is absent by the fact of its absence. So here's a bit of graffiti on a bridge in Paris in 1961 that means to comment upon the suppression of a manifestation, probably well known at this point in 1961, of a number of Algerians who were contesting the unequal distribution of civil rights in the city of Paris, much more so than the independence of their nation, and were, to some significant extent, massacred. And then the efforts to commemorate that massacre end up usually taking the form of absence and talking about bodies that were removed from view rather than reinstantiating those that were on view. So it would seem in some way that the other figure I want to talk about, whose name is Pierre Gaudi, is an entirely different story. He was an art critic of the communist left, and he became a curator of the Museum of the Modern Art of the City of Paris in 1967, where he created the large project, mission, exhibition, strategy series place called ARC, which was Animation, Research, and Confrontation, as a special laboratory in which he aimed to, in the words of Suzanne Paget in his obituary, he aimed to, quote, declass art. Before Gaudi, Paget asserted the museum, and abstractly the museum, not just this one, had been only for an elite class, and what he had tried to do, and she argues he had succeeded, was to open it to all people. And so here I'm just showing you, for example, one of the kinds of works that he might have championed. This is the work of a group in France called Grave, and another is the group of research audiovisual, and who did a number of participatory, active projects in the street that then are brought into museum spaces. This is not actually at ARC, but is from a retrospective in Mexico City a few years ago. But in that kind of popular or populist or integrated way of thinking about art in the museum, there's also something that has to be, I think, attended to. And it's the way, a little bit of what we think about political art or what art might be. So Gaudi was, I apologize for these images, he's most famous, and the ARC is most famous for what were called political at the time, or controversial shows, like one he mounted in 1969 called the Salon Rouge pour Vietnam, that was meant to show a number of works that contested and opposed the war, that marked a sympathy with some of the fighters in the war in Vietnam. And I'm just showing you an example of one by Rancière. These were works mostly characteristic of a school called the Nouvelle Figuration, New Figuration. And Gaudi was famous for, and ARC became famous for, is mostly remembered now for work like this. And he stayed on doing projects of this nature till 1972, when he was fired, essentially, for his involvement in the critique of a 1972 exhibition that was 12 years of contemporary art in France, often referred to as the Pompidou Show in advance of the Pompidou Center, and critiqued widely for its demonstration of the ways in which culture at that time was being reappropriated by a presidential purpose. So after his demission from this post, Gaudibert slowly transformed himself into one of the first curators and critics of modern African art, and that's a transition that I think is not unimportant in understanding the ways in which decolonization and its prioritization generated an art historical motivation during the decades following World War II. And he ended his career as the director of the Museum of Oceanic and African Arts in Paris. In a recent book called The Visual World of French Theory, Sarah Wilson has made a very compelling case that it was in critical theory that art historical writing and its critique of the, quote, political situation in France, that in this art theory, art history took its most pronounced form, and not only in relationship to contemporary practice. We all know, and she talks briefly about Foucault's writings on Las Meninas, for example, or Bataille on Manet, or as Deleuze, for example, on Bacon, though that's obviously a less historical example. And for the most part, I don't disagree with the thrust of that part of her argument, or the suggestion that it was in the theoretical gambits of, or rather that in their speculations about art practices, that a number of the late 20th century French theorists were able to cultivate their theoretical gambits, and particularly certain kinds of anti-statist ones. But in a careful defense of the political gambit itself of the new figuration, as opposed to the canonization of its contemporary institutional critique, which we know a little bit better in art histories, at least codified in the United States, she animates the various conflicts posed by the interpretive strategies of Sartre, Althusser, Deleuze, Lyotard, Derrida, and to a lesser degree Foucault, Baudrillard, and Bourdieu, as ways to present the narrative or historical content of art, primarily painting, as the locus of a political critique with the geopolitical circumstances surrounding the Cold War, rearrangement, so to speak, of Marxist and communist adherences in the wake of 1952, Suez Crisis, 1956 Hungary, or the Algerian War in 1945, really to 1962, or properly 1954 to 1962. So I'm not here, I just want to say, entirely convinced by the defense in this argument and the weight it places on content, which is to say also that I don't want to prioritize the demonstration or investment in content as one art historical model, as opposed to the aesthetic obscuring of content we see in something like Malraux, because no matter how deliberate the naming or the pointing to or gesturing of political conflict might be, do very little, I think these representations do very little to question the ways that the histories that they are picturing or re-narrativizing have been enabled to be presented. So in other ways, the ways in which they have been allowed to be experienced. Maybe something like from which points of an enunciation they could be articulated or claimed. So just looking very briefly at this work by Frommanger, it's called The Boulevard of the Italians, Boulevard des Italiens. Her claim is that this is participating, to roughly put, in a certain kind of repoliticization of French art in the 1960s and the ways in which it facilitated certain sorts of theoretical models. And one of the things that I would want to contest about this work, which takes as its subject matter this same manifestation in 1961, and makes specific references to the photographic capture by a journalist, a leftist photographer, by remaking these images as they might have appeared in 1971 and using these red figures again to represent certain absented bodies. valorizing this kind of project, I think, reinscribes this dichotomy of the content and context that the new art history that Fred was asking us to, I think, critique from various points of view, that narrates, to think about the critique that new art history provided to the narratives of civilization as a European aesthetic elite paradigm, that new art history, again, has this emphasis on content and context, and so a delimitation of what aesthetic practices might otherwise do or how they might otherwise contest, challenge, or alter the historical models that such narratives can codify. I'll just flip through these to say that Gaudi, the model he takes to some of the ways in which he wants to bring this model of forming a different public, for him a classed public around the project of contemporary art, might be thought also to derive from another model of bringing art to a public. This is in association with a group of paintings and some sculptures that he organized in 1964 to give to the new Algerian state as what he hoped and others with him hoped might be its first museum of modern art. And 50 years to this date, these works, which include, again, more of this sort of political art that would come to be the content of what he would curate to a large extent in the ARC. These works, no matter how sympathetic the point of view they present to the Algerian Revolution or Algerian independence, have yet to be amalgamated or brought into what is now actually is the Museum of Modern Art in Algiers. And so I want to just suggest, by way of conclusion, that these two figures tell us a little bit about the flip sides of the same coin, of the way art and art history, at least of the contemporary, were theorized in the 1950s and 60s, which is to say that Malraux was using the image to render history invisible and its erasure natural, and Gaudi was using, likely unwittingly, art to curtail any real purchase on the underlying structures that produced the histories into which it is placed. So thank you.